Hi, this is Aaron Azrod, and welcome to the 34th episode of the Truth Island podcast. It's a Saturday night, and your doorbell is ringing every 5 minutes as more and more of your friends start piling into your apartment. They each bring with them a six-pack of beer, assorted snack items that you'll probably regret eating the next day. They start gathering around the TV set. Being the nice friend that you are, you have just sprung 89.95 for the big fight tonight. The night begins with some prelim matches with this up-and-comer against this no-name guy. Some of these fights are entertaining, but you casually tune in and tune out, as these are not the fights that you really paid to see. You focus more on the nacho bowl, which you quickly see as diminishing as your hungry friends munch away, leaving crumbs all over the floor, which you and your wife will be begrudgingly having to deal with. "Hey, why don't you order a pizza?" one of your old high school friends shouts, and soon a small collection of assorted dollar bills begins to form on your table. Somehow you'll have to stuff this into your wallet as the pizza place already has your credit card on file. It's now 11:10 and the last promo video has aired and the main event is about to begin. The music hits and some guy you've never heard of makes his way out, but your friends assure you that he is a top fighter. After he has settled into the ring, the heavyweight champion makes his way out, greeted to a thunderous applause. All the idle chatter in your house has now come to an end, and every set of eyes has now fixated their attention solely on the television set. The bell rings and the two men size each other up for a while, exchanging rabbit punches and with their guard up. However, after just 2 minutes, the champion rushes in and hits the challenger with a clean shot to the chin. Shh! Knockout. At first, your household goes wild as the replaying the show over and over and over again. However, a thought soon creeps into your mind. I paid $90 for this? The energy in the room starts to shift, as some of your friends who had told you only minutes ago that this would be an epic clash amongst titans are now retracting the caliber of the challenger, tossing in names of other opponents who would have been much better suited. When we think of any athletic competition, we often demand that the best athletes, the best teams compete with one another. We have extensive vetting systems such as playoffs and fighting records, which ensure that the two most qualified individuals or teams face off. But what about in the realm of ideas? Let me ask you a question. When was the last debate you can think of where two highly intelligent individuals who disagreed with one another, let's say both with doctorates or extensive graduate training, debated in the sphere of politics, philosophy, or even science for that matter? Joining me now to make sense of this issue, I am once again joined with Joe. Joe, help me understand, why aren't we into intellectual fights the same way we are as boxing matches?
Hi, Aaron, and thank you for having me on. One reason that we may not even be able to form the demand of understanding who the other opponent is in certain circumstances because we live in our echo chambers on a daily basis. I think there are a lot of different reasons as to why that is. I think that sometimes things like social media really are attention-grabbing tools that essentially affirm what we believe. Therefore, we don't even necessarily know who the opponent would be in many circumstances. So we don't even know who to request as what would be a good dialogue and debate as far as an opponent would be concerned.
That's an awesome point, and one that I actually did not consider at all. So let's just say, for example, you're a hardcore liberal or a hardcore conservative. You don't know who the highly intelligent person is on the other side. So if you're a hardcore conservative, you don't know what PhD you should invite from the other side to kind of argue against your side. So it's almost you're almost completely ignorant as to who would be a worthy adversary.
That's right. And then this creates a vacuum where we only start to want to see our side actually prevail, and as far as the concern is with being right. And I think this kind of speaks to a bigger problem, is that we're more concerned with being right than to actually challenging our ideas. And I think that this now has become a time, specifically in political discourse, where it is starting to make it impossible to really engage with the other side because of this particular issue. And, it's really a shame because I think we become afraid to
Mm.
challenge ourselves in that process. And that's a scary thing.
Let me like ask you this question, for example. So let's just say you have a prominent liberal economist, right? And this liberal economist is arguing for more social welfare programs, more government intervention. I'm wondering, like, why there isn't this like impetus to at least research, like, okay, conservative economists or someone on the opposite side, and the same goes vice versa as well, to look up someone who also has like a doctorate in that same field of study who has published papers that are opposing in nature. Like I even if you're unaware of who your opposition should be. I'm wondering why there isn't that urgency or that there isn't that initiative to do a quick Google search and see who's out there that you could argue with.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And it really speaks to the idea of even how we look at discourse in general and prepare ourselves, meaning that if I want to really restate a problem or challenge somebody's opinion, I try and create a summary of their thoughts and trying to look at the world from their perspective. But this brings it back to the echo chambers where we're just looking for affirmation about our own ideas and turns into a shouting match. We really don't do that anymore. And I'm not exactly sure as to what was the main driver. I mean, inevitably, I do think the media has a huge role to play in this, as far as these channels being so siloed in their audiences. But I think that it's a lack of interest in challenging our own ideas and even taking the time to see why they've arrived at a certain conclusion. And especially when it comes to economics, I think that there's an important point here is that if you start to look at you're wrong in this one area, you might start to challenge all these other areas that you're thinking about. And I think that this would upend what it creates a certain unease with an individual where all of a sudden you find out you're wrong about, let's just say, monetary theory. And then you start to wonder what else you're wrong about.
Mm.
And I think that we're unwilling to really engage with those types of that type of uncertainty in in today's environment anyway.
Do you think that I had this it's funny, I just had this conversation earlier today that there's also a fear. So let's say I'm an intellectual heavyweight, a 72-year-old professor of economics. And if I go against a strong opponent and they knock me down, they just completely get me tied up, then all of my life's work could theoretically go in the garbage. So there's this fear that if I go against a really strong opponent and they really know their stuff and they embarrass me and make me look dumb, not only do I have that shame and embarrassment, but now my like credibility and my life's work might be in jeopardy.
Yeah, but that's the beauty of you. If you're a fighter, using your analogy,
Yeah,
you really want the best competition. And that's what
exactly.
I don't understand is that why wouldn't you want that competition? And that's not exactly clear to me as to why we're not seeking that. It's something that I think that there are a lot of external forces when it comes into the idea of how you're going to receive funding for what your research is going to provide.
Mm,
I think that there are some other ways of the environment itself where as far as popularity is concerned. So I do think there are some external forces that are actually shutting down this type of discourse. But I don't, it's a mystery. It's a bit of a mystery to me as to why you wouldn't want to seek the best person out to challenge your ideas. Because even if you lose, you still can come back and restate your position at any point in time. And I think people would appreciate that more times than not. But although I think the number of people that would appreciate that is probably lower than it has been in a long time.
And chances are, like, if you engaged in one of these intellectual battles, you probably are not wrong on everything. Like,
No.
nobody is wrong on everything. There might be a few theories or a few things that you might have to revise and tweak, and you're absolutely right. Like, that would actually just make you all that much more stronger, like on the next go around. I guess what it comes down to, Joe, is that there's two types of fighters, if you would. There's one type of fighter who wants to fight the strongest champion possible, right? And they need to prove it to themselves, like, okay, he's the best and I want to go against the best. But then there might be another type of fighter that's more strategic and says, that weaker guy has the title now. Okay, now I should step forward. So I'm wondering if there's that kind of like strategy going on where in order to appear smart, you have to carefully curate or select your opponents.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to like almost the newscasts that we were talking about. I was mentioning just a moment ago, is that you really can't have any kind of dissension,
Yeah.
and therefore you have to win. And not only do you have to win convincingly
Hmm.
in order to maintain your audience. And I think that there is a real problem with that because at that point, it starts to upend a number of other things where there can be no dissension. And that's what these echo chambers have created. And what happens in that process is the loss of real, genuine discourse that allows you to challenge your own ideas in the process. And as you mentioned, you're not always wrong. Like you're not ever 100% wrong.
Yeah.
So it's just a question of really how do you have to change your perspectives? And I don't think, it doesn't seem, at least intellectually speaking, that people are doing that as often as they used to.
Absolutely, yeah, and the key word is used to, because we will touch upon this later, that perhaps there was a time where that did happen. I want to talk about audience loyalty. So I think that the loyalty that fans have to a particular sports team or to a boxer is contingent upon them fighting at their best. And I think that is something like, especially when I watch UFC fights with my friends, they not only want their guy to win, but they want their guy to be against someone who's really, really strong. They're not just there to be like, oh yeah, my dude beat that chump or whatever. They really want their guy to win, but they want them to win against the highest opponent possible. And I'm wondering where we came up with this perverse loyalty where we're actually training people to be loyal to people that aren't all that intelligent. It's just that they've stacked the game to appear intelligent.
Yeah, now it's that is also a mystery to me because one of the things that I would even say in university campuses now, where you can't even have a differing view and go in to speak in these sometimes into these environments, at least certain environments anyway. One of the things that I used to be impressed with, and I don't want to jump ahead too far here because I know that you want to come to that, but I used to be impressed with how people like Milton Friedman would go into university environments knowing full well that he was the opposing view.
Right.
And everybody in there was actually looking to challenge him, and he was looking to challenge other people. And it was like at Stanford, it was at these great schools. And for whatever reason, now we have this perspective of they're not even allowed to come here to speak.
Hmm. Hmm.
And and I don't know what that transition was, why that curiosity, that intellectual curiosity, what happened with that. I think that there are a lot of factors that that have gone into the and I think funding is one of those things.
One of it's funny you mentioned that, and this is not too long ago, but one of my favorite political talk shows growing up was a show on CNN called Crossfire in the like
Yeah.
early 2000s. That show I really, really, really loved because it actually pit people of opposing views that were of equal caliber, and it was done in a very like media oriented ratings kind of like, this was before clickbait was a thing, so it was kind of done in that way, but nonetheless you actually did have intelligent people that were well informed on both sides have these like debates and have these discussions with one another. And I'm like, I can't think of a single program today that actually has like Democrats and Republicans sitting across the aisle from one another and talking in long form with one another. I can't think of a single show that even does that today.
Not even close. And I'll go a step further is that, one of the individuals that used to be on Crossfire, if you remember, was Tucker Carlson.
Yeah, he was, right.
And so look at him now.
Yeah.
I mean, he's a perfect example of how ratings and have made him, and echo chambers have allowed or made him acquiesce to this almost absolutist. I need to not only be right, but you really need to be wrong. And
Yes.
that is as important as me being, making my point. So I need to show you that you're really an idiot. And that's completely unfortunate because, he was usually engaging with, I believe, with somebody like James Carville.
Yeah, yeah, right.
So I mean, yeah, but you never see, a James Carville on
Tucker Carlson
Tucker
anymore.
Carlson anymore. I mean, you wouldn't even, and it shows you where we've gone media wise.
Yes.
And I think that that's a really big part of why we're not having, we're not seeing other intellectuals engage with one another is because, relatively speaking, Tucker Carlson is successful by a
Yeah.
certain standard, right? So he's willing to compromise himself in this environment. And I think that, you start to see one person do it, then you start to see others probably follow suit.
I would actually argue that, and it's actually the same case with Sean Hannity. His show used to be called Hannity and Combs back in the day, and he used to have, he actually did not host the show himself. He had a liberal co-host on the show. I would say that Sean Hannity and Tucker Carlson were probably smarter people when they had to kind of have someone to keep them in check at all times, because it forced them to actually pick out their words, be very, very precise with what they're arguing, have counter examples. They had to be a lot sharper, a lot more on point when they were kept in check at all times. And it was a friendly check. Like I think Tucker Carlson and Carville were pretty friendly to one another, and so was Combs and Hannity. It wasn't like I hate you and like I'm trying to get you. They would have heated debates and debate, heated arguments, here and there, but I think that makes you sharper. And I actually, on my podcast, I do record a few solo episodes here and there for a few minutes, but that's it. I need another human being to keep me in check, because I think that when you're just going on and on and on and on by yourself, you kind of develop a godlike complex, and you're actually a lot dumber because no one is calling you out on your shit.
That's just it. You're not able. You're not articulate anymore. You're actually preaching. You're not thinking. And,
Yes.
and I think that that's what the difference is that when you have somebody else's your opposing view every single night, that you may find out in the course of that discussion that actually you do agree with the other side on a particular issue, and may cause you to but at the very least you're going to be much more precise in your wording, and it's going to be a different conversation. The thing that and I don't watch Tucker Carlson or anybody with those types of shows anymore, those opinion shows, but the idea that I remember him, he was like laughing at someone as a way of almost humiliating them.
Wow.
And I thought to myself, wow, do you realize how far you've actually fallen? And as opposed to if you had someone else that with an opposing viewpoint, you would actually be engaging with that individual. And so and it's a real loss. That's the problem. It's the losses for the audience, not necessarily for him personally as well.
I
But
think it's a loss for any figure, and and we're talking about the right a lot, but you also have like Rachel Maddow. You have also the left's version of this as well, where it's one person, they call the shots, they got the weak counterpoint going up against them. So
sure.
I think this happens on CNN and on MSNBC in the opposite fashion, and I think it's actually a loss for the audience. It's a loss for that host, because that host isn't growing intellectually. That host
Absolutely.
is surrounded by yes people. Yes, 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 yes. So we will get these plans. So they're not growing. The audience is not growing, and it's a universal loss for humanity in a way, because that it shouldn't. There used to be a doctrine actually when it came to the news called
The
like
fairness doctrine.
yeah, the fairness doctrine, where
Yeah, yeah.
you had to actually give equal time. And this was, I think, I don't even think there was cable TV back then. This was just, the basic 7 channels like ABC, NBC, and so forth. But then I think cable news came out, and they didn't have to follow the fairness doctrine anymore.
Yeah, and it was repealed under, I believe, under Ronald Reagan.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah, so I believe, I mean, I have to double check, but I believe that was repealed under Ronald Reagan. And what you saw was essentially this, it used to be equal time on both sides, but now you don't even see that. But I'll go a step further. There used to be a show, Firing Line.
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
with Bill Buckley, where he would have somebody like Noam Chomsky on.
Yes, yeah, epic, epic.
Those were epic battles, and it was, everybody was better for it.
Yes,
And and now you couldn't find anything close to that. Now I will say there is a Firing Line show that's on PBS that I haven't seen all that often because I just haven't had time. But there would be Paul Krugman and somebody, the host I believe is from the Cato Institute or the Hoover Institute, I think. So that where it was opposing views and there were tough questions, but it's still not the same level of like differing opinions where you had Firing Line, where it was just these they would have intellectuals really discussing ideas that then everybody was better off for these things.
Yeah, yeah. And you know what? Thinking about a show like Crossfire or whatever, I don't know, like these guys, are very charismatic, and they have communication skills. Some may even have like acting skills or have like an acting background and so forth. I think when you have these shows, you really need to get the best in the field, like the cream of the crop, intellectual heavyweights, and get them to kind of debate, because I don't think there's because even if you have one of these people who like majors in communication and is very articulate and very charismatic, they might just win the argument based on their wink, nod, and charm. And
Right.
that's also kind of a danger. Like if and some of these academics can be a little stuffy and a little monotone. So you have to think of these things like really, really, really carefully. Of like, we need top of the line people, and we don't want somebody to just have the edge. And people are going to argue with me and be like, Aaron, you're going to put everyone to sleep. But I think this is what we need, and we kind of.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, otherwise, because what you have is an electorate that's uninformed, and essentially that you only look at one side as being absolute.
Yes.
And I think that that's where, and I do think, I will say this, in pockets, I do believe that there is still some very good intellectual discourse going on, but it's such a small percentage of media these days, and there really doesn't seem to be an incentive for these guys to engage with one another. I mean, I don't want to say, like, you can even see venture capitalists with different perspectives,
Yeah.
that are willing to engage, and people with differing opinions, like I think it's David Epstein with the book Range, and Malcolm Gladwell.
Yeah. Malcolm.
Sorry, yeah. So, and they would engage each other based on their differing opinions. So it still goes on. It's just not at the same level that it seems like it's not as mainstream as it used to be. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Now, in fairness, like let's just say you got the producers and the executives at all of these news network, and they would be like, Aaron, Joe, we hear you, man, we hear you. But here's the deal. People aren't going to tune in if we put these heavyweight intellectual forces against one another. Like, we need the zingers, we need this. And they actually do make a point, because it's like, all right now we've been so stupefied, or whatever word you want to use. Like, we might actually be at such a low level right now that if we did take these hyper intellectuals and put them up against one another, maybe very few people would tune in. So I'm wondering, Joe, what do you think is our personal responsibility to get smarter? Because I think that we as citizens have a responsibility to increase our stamina and to increase our threshold for things that we may initially find boring.
I mean, for me personally, it's the most important thing that I strive for is I actually seek out opinions to prove me wrong.
Wow. Wow.
I mean, for me, I always engage with individuals that have, and I always will take the differing opinion. The opposite, whomever I'm conversing with, whether it be conservative or whether it be a liberal person. I like to hear what I would like to restate why, what it would look like from a liberal perspective
Yes.
and what it would look like from a conservative's perspective, because then I can start to arrive at the conclusions. I can see how they arrived at their conclusions and why it's so difficult for them to actually open up and listen to other people. And I think that that's been a mystery to me, is that I do feel we're morally responsible for our bettering ourselves and engaging, but I don't know how much of a market there is for that. These executives are probably seeing what you just mentioned and said, we could put it out there and it would be a public service, but you're probably going to look at the ratings being what they are now, where PBS is in the middle here, and then you have Fox and MSNBC, right? Up
Yeah.
here.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of drowns out a lot of good dialogue.
We were just in a meetup about sins of omission, right? And it's like all
Yeah.
the things that you don't do. And I think that every time we refuse to engage with somebody who has opposite viewpoints, we refuse to engage at a highly intellectual level, we as a society are collectively committing sins of omission. Like we are committing sins of omission by not engaging at the highest levels and and living in an echo chamber. I think if you live in an echo chamber, you want your worldview to be completely made out of concrete and never shatter, and that right itself is a sin of omission.
Well, and the other part is you might get kicked out of that echo chamber if you have a differing opinion.
That's insane. And then you would think that someone living in the echo chamber, like imagine you're living in, I don't know how, I guess it's like through a forum probably is where most of these things go through, but let's just say you're in a liberal or conservative echo chamber and they know you, right? They know, hey, Aaron's a good guy. He thinks the same way as us. And then I differ on one little tiny minutia thing. Now I'm all of a sudden like exiled from the community. But it's like you would think that I would have gained already an in that group where they know and trust me by now that I could have some differing opinions. Are you even seeing that?
No, I mean it's not at all. And I mean comes into this absolutism that is
Yeah, yeah.
actually starting to exist, and I think that you're seeing this in the parties. I think that and I've said this many times, they're becoming religions.
Yes, yes,
And,
yo.
that these are like dogmatic institutions instead of areas where if you deviate, they think it's going to automatically upend everything that they believe.
I think
And
it's worse than religions. I think Christians and Jews get along like
right,
much better than Republicans and Democrats at
they
this
do
point.
now. Absolutely. No, yeah, no. And especially if you broke it down by within sects of those groups, yeah, they absolutely get along better and are willing to talk to one another much more than
Yeah,
say Democrats and Republicans. And I don't, and this is where one thing that I had mentioned, and I'd asked a question to Roger, and it was one of the more profound insights at one of our meetups, why there isn't this discourse when it
yeah.
comes to economics and politics. And, he really answered it beautifully and said, well, look, if you admit you're wrong on this one thing, then all of a sudden it becomes much bigger than just that one instance. So therefore
Mm.
you can't deviate from the party line. And, that's where but that's no different than if you're going to say, almost have a creed, for a religion. And so that if if you do deviate, then everything else is on the table. And I think that that's what people are really afraid of, actually, or the parties are too. I mean, as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, a few summers ago, there were some Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris debates. And these guys are opposites in many respects. Like Sam Harris is hardcore atheist. Peterson isn't like a direct theist, but he has obviously mythological / religious inclinations that he
Sure.
kind of brings to his perspective. And this was a rousing success. Like this was the WrestleMania of intellectual discourse. And the thing that disappointed me the most is that, I think these three debates happened in Toronto or Canada, if I'm not mistaken. When they were over, it just ended. And there was no other, there was no, I thought we were going to experience an intellectual renaissance where this would be the first debate and then we would get Noam Chomsky and other intellects into the fray, but it just ended right there. And there's people on the internet calling for like a Noam Chomsky, Jordan Peterson debate. Now, in fairness to Chomsky, he is like in his mid 90s now, and he does speak a lot. It is a little more difficult for him to pack the punch, but like there needs to be that kind of resurgence. I think that kind of energy that was going on a few summers ago needs to be resparked and rekindled.
And and we're all at a loss if that doesn't happen. And then you're right. You see something like that occur, and you're excited, and you see like, okay, this is going to be a renaissance of like, where real intellectual discourse is going to start to take hold again. I still actually, as just as a side note, I do still think Noam Chomsky could probably hold his own, even at his advanced age. I really do. I think that he's such a great mind.
Yeah, yeah.
So that, but at the same time, there just doesn't seem to be enough interest, and I'm not sure why, if that's not being generated at the university level, because I think that that's a really important point, is that sometimes universities, they, at one point, if you were going to have the opposing view, I know even at a fairly conservative school that right around me is Villanova, and it is I think it was Charles Murray was going to go and speak there, and they said no, and they actually did some embarrassing things in the process. I don't agree with Charles Murray on anything really, much anyway. Yet I think that the students were at a disservice by not allowing him to speak there, and
My,
that seems to manifest itself on a bigger level, I think.
Or let's do one better. Why not have Charles Murray speak to an eminent biologist or a psychologist of IQ, or that would have been like the perfect setup. You got Charles Murray here with the bell curve, and now we got a PhD in psychology or neurobiology who believes that IQ is completely fake, and let these intellectual titans clash with one another and talk about like the significance and the p-values in this like journal, and like I want to see that. And I think that there is I will say this, I think there is an appetite for that, but there is some unknown force that is preventing this from happening. Because when I look at the comments of these little flare-ups or these little intellectual debates, I see in the comments like, man, I want to see Peterson talk to this guy, or I want to see Chomsky debate blah blah blah, and there is like an interest and there is an appetite for this. I think that there's something else at play that's preventing these dialogues from happening.
Yeah, I mean, and it's really hard to put your finger on it. It really is. And I think part of it is that it's just genuine interest. I
Yeah.
don't know if there's the interest in hearing what someone else with an opposing view has to say anymore. I think that this is why sometimes you can see a great intellectual debate and it's going to be a one-off, because it's just not a sustainable model where there's enough people that are interested. Now, at universities, they would actually, that's where you cultivate that.
Yes.
And that's where you cultivate that interest. But if you don't have that diversity of thought, then there's not going to be much of a market of it when you're talking about the educated public getting out into the forum, and they're used to hearing what they want to hear, to be quite honest. That it's kind of it could be an indicator for something that we're just not seeing, in the sense that, speaking to what you had mentioned with the idea of the unknown force, it's just, maybe it's as simple as universities are marketing themselves, and kids want to go where they want to hear what they want to hear.
We're basically not cultivating an audience that has that wants this on the menu.
Exactly, and it's kind of alarming that we're going down this road, because I think that one thing that we could probably speak to is the idea of the debates.
Yes,
Um,
I want to
yeah,
talk about that now. We're going to keep this pretty politically neutral here, but one thing that I saw from this, and as a history teacher, I've shown my students several times the Kennedy Nixon debates, and people have a lot of takes on that. They said, oh, if Nixon would have just put makeup on or shaved, he would have won. Like this, there's many different angles and spins on that. But one thing is that they get into this one bit with Nixon and Kennedy about space exploration and public school funding. It is at such a high level. They are so respectful to one another. They're like, oh, I respectfully disagree with my colleague standing over there. And they have all of the facts, they have the points, it's measured, and regardless of who you think won those debates, you saw real classy politicians, and it's kind of a shame that Nixon went ahead and ruined his career the way that he did,
right.
because like when you see him in the debates, he can actually hold his own, and it's a travesty what he actually ended up doing with his presidency. But that's a side note. But the idea is that the level of respect and the level of just intellectual cultivation was much higher. And I think that regardless of whether you're a Democrat or Republican, that was not there a few nights ago during the presidential debate.
No, I mean that was blood sport essentially, and it was just basically. I think it really represented what you see in the newscasts. Coming back to what we were talking about earlier, is that who can shout louder, and in this particular case, there was constant interruptions, and that was kind of, again, that's what people are used to seeing.
Yes,
And
yes.
and the again, keeping it apolitical, but that's what the candidates see as well, so therefore they're going to mirror that. And then it just becomes a situation of who can yell louder. I was troubled by those debates for a number of reasons. It was something there that had been lost far more than just that one particular bit debate. It was I think that it was the death of certain discourse.
One thing that is also starting to scare me a little bit is, prior to the Civil War, for example, I forgot his name, but there's this one senator that actually attacks another senator with a cane and starts like hitting him repeatedly. I forgot the name of him. And once you get into, and the same thing, I was speaking to my Roman Empire expert friend when we were doing our podcast about once senators and once politicians start physically hitting one another, then there's going to be a civil war. Like that's kind of the precursor to any kind of civil war or civil unrest. Is just it takes one punch. And did anyone get punched on that stage? No, but it's inching closer and closer and closer and closer. Especially, I think that Biden and Trump are both alpha males. They both, have that kind of alpha energy about them. I think it's inching closer and closer and closer because when you start, I think that we'll start dropping profanities. Like the first step is profanities are going to start entering the presidential debate. Once we hit profanities, it might cross that line to some kind of physical scuff that will be quickly broken up. But that's that. In history's sake, once one politician hits another, we go through a really dark process.
And I think in a way, you don't even necessarily need to get physical with it. That's the end. That's the real sign of the end. But before you even get there, I think it's even a step further. It's when you start disrespecting the political process, and meaning, legislation and how things are getting done.
I think though that both of these things, whether it's moves being done that circumvent democracy on both sides, I kind of have this issue that maybe when we're circumventing laws, it's because we're tapping into a more primal element of our brain. I actually think that because when you really think about it, rules and laws came about because really strong men were probably beating up weaker men, women, children, and just dominating civilization. Like, right? Like, I would
Yeah.
imagine, like,
Yeah, sure.
if we think of an early civilization, it was probably really, really muscular men just beating the crap out of people and basically beating them down into submission. And then someone came along and said, "Hey, we got to have laws. It can't Society just can't function like this anymore." And I think that once we start circumventing laws, we're going back to that mentality of big muscles and just
Right.
beating people down, only we're not using our muscles, we're using guns and weapons to do so.
Absolutely, and I think that that's exactly where we are. And that's probably that's a beautiful analogy as well, because it actually speaks to the idea of the physical altercations, that how we're reverting back to some of these primal instincts as opposed to actually following civil discourse. And I think that this is part of the whole entire problem as to why, like, if we're not engaging with one another, it turns into that. Because if you're not engaging the other side in an honest intellectual debate and you're just shouting them down, this is what the result is. And I think you saw that on Tuesday evening last week.
Yes.
So and you see how far. And I will say this: I got to be honest. I didn't speak to anybody that didn't feel depressed
Mm, mm.
after that debate. I mean, everybody felt awful.
Yes.
So, I think that that's kind of, I hope that's a good sign in a way.
I hope, well, it could be a good sign, it could be a bad sign. It could be good if people say, "Man, I'm really depressed by what I saw," and then they follow that up with, "What kind of better figures could we have running the country?" And if they followed that thought up of, like, are there smarter people that we could have put on that stage last night? Then I think we're heading in a positive direction, and then I think our intellectual muscle might actually start increasing. Or it could go into the direction of, "Man, I didn't like what I saw, and let's just double down on
Right.
this physical kind of lowbrow aggression." And I I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm getting that feeling that people didn't watch that debate and said, "All right, let me pick up the Noam Chomsky book right now and sort of and start getting
Right.
smarter." I
Right.
think they're starting to double down on the lowbrow, physical aggressive side of them.
And I think it's because they're so afraid of being wrong.
Yes.
And this is kind of to the point of the discussion. When you're afraid of being wrong, then you're going to double down, and this is what you end up as a result. And you will not be able to really contemplate in a clear, concise way of how am I going to necessarily get out of this, because I know I don't like it, but I really know I don't like this. So I'm going to double down on what I don't like and
Mm.
acquiesce to this candidate. And that's really scary, because I don't know where we're going to get the political will, or even the nudge, so to speak, to really start engaging the other side. I mean, because I do see people doubling down on their preferences.
Absolutely, and I think that when you double down like this, it creates certainty. Like you have, because I think one thing I will say, and I when I was a young kid, I did get into a few fights after school, is
Mm-hmm.
that physical altercations, or this doubling down mentality provides absolute certainty. Like, oh, there's a clear winner, there's a clear loser, and so forth. Whereas it's much harder work to exist in the gray area. It's much harder to exist in, like, the crossfire or frontline atmosphere of, like, "Oh, I concede that point to you. I think you're right on that policy, but I think I'm right on this." And that's a much more disciplined and a much more vulnerable state to be in than, let me just wail at this person and give it all that I got.
It's hard work.
It is
I
hard
mean,
work.
it's really hard work, because you're constantly checking yourself as opposed to just telling yourself you're right.
Yes.
And, one takes a hell of a lot more time than the other.
Absolutely.
And that's another aspect of it, is that, what's the level of effort that I'm going to, where am I going to get my bang for my buck? And I think a lot of people will end up saying, more times than not, that I'm going to double down on where I am, just because I don't have enough time to even engage in these ideas the way we. And when they're not easily able to be consumed. In other words, these debates that of intellectuals, really, from opposing viewpoints, being readily accessible for everyone. Not to say that they're that hard to get to, but when they're
Yeah.
not popular, when they're not really all the rage, well, then you start to see that, as you mentioned, you start to revert back into what is easiest, the path of least resistance.
Yes, yes. I think you said it beautifully. We're kind of subscribing to a dumber culture because it's the path of least resistance. It is easy, it is accessible, and we don't it's and but we're learning that the easy path is the path that leads to like the debate we saw a few nights ago, and it's highly depressing.
Yeah, and this comes back to the idea of religions as well, right? Religions have all the answers for you, right? You just have to go there and research it and be part of the community, right? That's it. But when you venture out and challenge those ideas, that's a lot harder.
Yeah.
You're out on your own. You're not part of a community. You're not doing, so you're challenging everything that you had previously, believed, or that you may still believe. It depends, whatever.
And there's loneliness. If you leave your echo chamber, you're all alone now. Because when you leave the echo chamber, you've now been exiled or banished from your echo chamber friends. And a new echo chamber is not going to absorb you because you still have old beliefs being kind of conflicted with new beliefs. So you don't belong in any echo chamber, and now you're in no man's land.
That's right. And there's a lot of fear that goes into that. So I think that that's where you're starting to see people again double down on what they already believe. And this is where, in the parties, this is why discourse between the parties has just broken down altogether. And it's because if you venture out on one issue, you're alone. You're
Yes,
out
you
there.
are.
I mean, you might as well be an independent at that point. I mean, so it's like, it's like, well, I agree with you on 99 things, but yeah, but the 100th one is where I disagree. So, oh, you're independent. It's like, it's like, no, that's not really, no, I'm with you guys. But, and this is where, unfortunately, it's almost as if, you need another party, or you need another way of even talk about it some other time, is the idea of how voting is done, and things along those lines, how we select our candidates. But that's the result of not
Well,
engaging each other.
hopefully, at least I'm trying here to create a refuge here on Truth Island of us people that have been banished from all echo chambers, and then we
Exactly.
can kind of find a community. And I think 52 Living Ideas also kind of does a good job of giving us exiles a home to be at. Joe, once again, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Oh, thank you, Aaron, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.
Awesome. This concludes the 34th episode of the Truth Island podcast. I'm Aaron Azarod.